Hello, and welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. If you enjoy late, night tales that mix real experiences with a touch of mystery, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep these bedtime stories alive, so you can drift into the night with a story echoing in your mind. Now, let's step into tonight's story. The storm that trapped us in a motel in Kansas. It was late spring of 2017, the kind of season when the skies above Kansas could turn from calm blue to menacing gray in the span of a single afternoon. My friend Daniel and I were driving back from Denver to St. Louis, taking the long route along the I-70. We had been on the road since early morning, and by the time the sun began to lower, painting the horizon in streaks of amber and crimson, the radio interrupted the soft country music with a sharp weather warning. Tornado watch for Russell County moving east, the announcer's voice crackled. Daniel gave me a quick look, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. We were somewhere near Wilson, a small town that seemed almost swallowed by endless wheat fields. The wind had already started to push against the car, making it sway gently at first, then more violently as minutes passed. By the time we spotted the glowing sign of a roadside motel, faded red letters buzzing against the darkening sky, we knew we couldn't risk driving any further. The motel was called Prairie Haven. It looked like something left behind in the 1960s. A long row of single-story rooms, paint peeling from the wooden doors, and a flickering neon vacancy sign that hummed in the rising wind. We pulled into the gravel lot just as the first drops of heavy rain began to slap against the windshield. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and damp carpet. The woman at the reception, whose name tag read Janet, greeted us with a weary smile. "You boys picked the right time to stop," she said, sliding the room key across the counter. "They're saying the storm will sit over this county for hours." We carried our bags into room 7. The place was simple. 2 creaky beds, a small TV bolted to the wall, and faded curtains that rattled against the window as the storm gained strength. Daniel turned on the Weather Channel, and the screen lit up with a map covered in red blotches and swirling arrows. Then, as the clock struck 9:15 p.m., the storm truly arrived. Rain hammered the roof in sheets, the wind howled through the cracks of the old building, and thunder rolled so deeply it felt like the earth itself was shifting beneath us. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied, though the hum of the power lines outside made it clear they could fail at any second. From the thin walls we could hear the faint voices of other travelers. Families, couples, a trucker or two, all huddled in their rooms, caught in the same situation as us. There was a strange comfort in that shared experience, as if the storm had gathered strangers together and pressed pause on all our separate lives. I stood by the window, peeking through the slit in the curtains. Across the parking lot, the neon sign flickered, fighting against the gusts of wind. Beyond that, the horizon had vanished into a wall of rain and lightning. For a moment, it felt as though the motel was a tiny island floating in a dark and violent sea. Daniel broke the silence. "You think this place has a basement?" he asked, his voice low. Before I could answer, a knock echoed on our door. Slow, deliberate, and loud enough to be heard over the storm. The knock on the door came again, firm and deliberate. For a second, Daniel and I froze, exchanging uncertain glances. Outside, the wind howled like a restless animal, and the rain battered the thin walls of the motel. Whoever was standing out there was braving one of the fiercest storms I had ever witnessed. Daniel motioned for me to stay back. then walked slowly toward the door. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he leaned close and called out, "Who's there?" A voice answered, muffled by the storm. "It's Janet from the front desk." Relief washed through me. Daniel cracked the door open, just enough to see her standing in the dim light of the corridor, her uniform slightly damp from the rain that had found its way inside. Her expression was serious. "Sorry to bother you," she said, raising her voice over the storm. "But the power company just called. They're expecting outages tonight. If the lights go out, stay in your rooms until I knock again. We have a storm shelter in the basement, but it's small. I'll let you know if we need to move." Daniel nodded, thanked her, and closed the door. For a moment, we stood in silence, listening to the groan of the wind pressing against the windows. The thought of being herded into a cramped basement with strangers made my chest tighten, but it also reassured me that there was a plan. The night dragged on. At 10 p.m., the lights flickered again, then steadied. The TV buzzed with weather updates, maps filled with bright red patches stretching across Kansas. The announcer's voice was steady, but the urgency beneath it was impossible to ignore. Around 10:30, we heard footsteps in the corridor, then another knock, this time on the room next to ours. A man's voice, low and gruff, answered through the wall. Snippets of conversation floated into our room, Janet telling him the same thing she had told us. It struck me how strange it was. All of us trapped here together, yet separated by thin layers of wood and plaster. I sat on the bed, the mattress dipping under my weight, and stared at the rain streaming down the window. Every flash of lightning illuminated the parking lot for a split second, the puddles spreading across the gravel, the neon signs sputtering with stubborn light. Each clap of thunder felt closer than the last. Daniel tried to lighten the mood. "Remember when we got stuck in that cabin in Colorado? At least this time we have running water and a TV." I forced a laugh, though the unease in my stomach only grew. Something about this storm felt different, more personal, more intent on testing our nerves. At 11 p.m., the inevitable happened. The lights blinked once, twice, then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the occasional blue-white burst of lightning through the curtains. For a moment, all we could hear was the storm itself, pounding and shrieking around us. Daniel fumbled for his phone, its screen casting a weak glow across his face. "Guess this is it," he muttered. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, as if fabric could shield me from the growing sense of isolation. The motel suddenly felt much older, its flaws more apparent in the dark. The draft seeping through the window, the faint creak of the roof under the weight of rain, the hollow echo of footsteps somewhere down the corridor. Then came another knock. Not Janet's this time. This one was softer, hesitant, almost unsure. Daniel and I exchanged a look. He whispered, "Do we open it?" I shook my head, listening carefully. The knock repeated, followed by a voice, this time younger, shakier. "Hello? Anyone? Please, is anyone there?" It didn't sound like Janet. It didn't sound like anyone we had seen when we checked in. My throat went dry. Daniel pressed his ear to the door. "Who is it?" he asked. The reply came quickly. "My name's Emily. My car broke down the road. I was trying to find somewhere safe. Please let me in." The words trembled, as if carried on the edge of panic. I hesitated, my mind torn between caution and compassion. The storm outside was brutal. If she really was stranded, Standing out there could be life-threatening. Yet, something about the timing unnerved me. Why would someone be walking alone in a storm this severe? When the warnings had been blaring for hours, Daniel turned to me. "What do you think?" I swallowed hard. If she's telling the truth, we can't leave her out there. But I didn't need to finish the sentence. The unease was clear in both our minds. Another knock. Urgent this time. "Please, I just need somewhere safe until the storm passes." The wind roared, rattling the doorframe as if to emphasize the danger outside. Daniel placed his hand on the doorknob, hesitating, waiting for my nod. When I finally gave it, he unlocked the door and pulled it open just a crack. Lightning flashed behind her, revealing a young woman in a soaked jacket, her hair plastered to her face. She looked terrified, her eyes wide, her breath clouding in the cold draft that rushed in with her. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping inside before either of us could say more. The door shut with a dull thud, sealing the three of us into the dimly lit room. The storm continued its relentless assault outside, but now there was a new tension inside. A silence heavy with unasked questions. Emily dropped her small backpack onto the floor and wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "I'm sorry for barging in," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what else to do. My car died about a mile back, and the rain." She cut herself off, glancing toward the window as thunder cracked overhead. Daniel offered her a towel from the bathroom, and she accepted it with a faint smile of gratitude. Yet, as she dried her hair, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, three strangers sat in a small, dimly lit motel room, waiting for a night that felt like it might never end. And in the back of my mind, a thought grew louder with every passing minute. Sometimes the most unsettling part of a storm isn't what it does to the world outside, but the secrets it can bring through your door. The air in the room felt heavier once Emily sat down on the edge of the bed opposite mine. Her jacket was still damp, leaving dark patches on the blanket. The storm outside had become a constant roar. And yet, even above its fury, the silence between the three of us pressed down like a weight. Daniel tried to break it. "You said your car broke down? Out there?" Emily nodded quickly. "Yes, I was driving back from Selena, heading east, when my engine just died. I thought I could maybe walk to the next town, but the rain hit so fast. I barely made it this far." Her voice cracked slightly, as though exhaustion and fear were catching up with her. I studied her face in the pale glow of Daniel's phone flashlight. She looked young, maybe mid-20s. There was sincerity in her expression, but something about the way her eyes darted toward the door every few seconds unsettled me. "Did you see anyone else on the road?" I asked. Her head shook slowly. "No, just the storm. No cars passed me." She pressed the towel tighter around her shoulders. It felt like the world had just disappeared. Outside, the thunder rolled again, so loud it seemed to shake the thin walls of the motel. The neon sign flickered against the window, each burst of light casting strange shadows across Emily's face. Daniel exhaled. "Well, you're safe now, at least until morning. Once the storm clears, someone can help you with your car." She nodded, though her hands still trembled as they clutched the towel. For a while, none of us spoke. The storm was a conversation of its own, filling the silence with every crash and howl. Occasionally, I thought I heard other noises. Footsteps in the corridor, the faint click of another door shutting. But it was hard to tell whether it was real or just my imagination mixing with the storm's chaos. Around midnight, there was another knock at the door, this time louder, more insistent. Daniel stood quickly, his eyes cutting toward me. "Stay there," he whispered to Emily, then approached the door. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps. He pressed his ear against the wood. "Who is it?" he called. A pause. Then Janet's voice answered, though fainter than before. "Everyone to the basement. The storm's shifting. It's too dangerous to stay in the rooms." Daniel looked back at me. I nodded, though unease twisted in my stomach. The timing was odd. Why would she come alone in this weather, when earlier she had said she would return if needed? He unlatched the lock. When the door swung open, the corridor was empty. No Janet. No footsteps retreating, just the whirling darkness beyond the cracked glass of the outer door, and the storm pouring itself into every gap it could find. Emily gasped. "She's not there." Daniel stepped out into the corridor, peering left and right. "Maybe she already went to the next room," he murmured. His voice was steady, but I could hear the strain behind it. "Close the door," I said quickly, a chill running down my spine. "Now," he did, shutting us back inside. For a moment, the room felt like a fragile cocoon against a world gone mad. But questions pressed at the edges of my thoughts. Who had knocked? And why mimic Janet's voice? Emily whispered, "Maybe it was the wind. Or maybe she went down the hall before you opened it." I wanted to believe her, but the sound of those knocks was too deliberate, too human. We decided to wait. There was nothing else to do. Leaving the room felt dangerous, yet staying inside offered only the illusion of safety. Minutes stretched into hours. Around 1 in the morning, the power surged back briefly, the TV blaring static before dying again. In that brief flash, I caught a glimpse of Emily's reflection in the darkened screen. Her eyes weren't on the storm. They were on the door. Something about that unsettled me more than the thunder. Daniel, restless, kept pacing. "We can't just sit here all night," he muttered. "What if the roof gives in? Do you hear it creaking?" I asked. We both listened. The rain was relentless, the wind violent. But above it all, there was indeed a sound, faint groaning, as though the wood was bending under pressure. Emily hugged herself tighter. "We should go to the basement," she whispered. Her words made sense, yet the image of that empty corridor haunted me. If it wasn't Janet who had knocked, then who, or what, was waiting out there? At 2 a.m., the storm seemed to reach its peak. Lightning turned the night into day for a second at a time, thunder shaking the floor beneath us. The window rattled so hard I feared it would shatter. We had pushed the dresser in front of the door, not wanting to risk another unexpected visitor. Then came a sound that froze the blood in my veins. Not a knock this time, a slow drag, as if something heavy was being pulled along the corridor outside. It stopped in front of our room. Silence followed, broken only by the storm. Emily's breathing quickened. She whispered, "Someone's out there." Daniel gripped the flashlight like a weapon, his jaw tight. We waited. The silence stretched, suffocating. Then the dragging noise started again, moving away this time, fading down the hall. None of us spoke. By 3 a.m., exhaustion began to settle in, though fear kept me from sleep. I sat against the headboard, watching the curtains billow with each gust of wind, listening to every creak and groan of the building. Daniel finally lay down, though his eyes never fully closed. Emily remained perched on the edge of the bed, her gaze fixed on the door as though expecting it to open at any moment. The storm outside showed no sign of ending, and inside, the three of us were caught in a different kind of storm, one of suspicion, fear, and the gnawing sense that something in the motel was not what it seemed. The night wasn't over yet, and I had the feeling that what lay ahead would test us even more than the storm raging outside. The storm showed no mercy. By 3:30 in the morning, it felt as if the walls themselves were trembling, each gust of wind pressing against them like a giant hand trying to tear the building apart. The rattling of the glass was constant, and every crash of thunder reverberated through my bones. Inside room 7, we were prisoners of both the weather and our own unease. Daniel sat upright on his bed now, his back against the wall, the flashlight clutched in his hand. Emily still hadn't relaxed. She remained perched near the corner of her mattress, knees drawn to her chest, her damp hair hanging loose across her face. Her eyes never stopped moving between the door and the window, as though she was tracking two threats at once. I tried to keep my breathing steady, though my mind was restless. The dragging sound in the corridor replayed itself in my thoughts. Whatever had made that noise was deliberate. It wasn't the storm, and it wasn't my imagination. Something, or someone, had been right outside our door. Suddenly, the dresser we had pushed in front of the door creaked. Not from the storm. The sound was different, subtle, low, like pressure being applied from the other side. Emily's sharp intake of breath cut through the room. "It's back," she whispered. Daniel jumped to his feet, flashlight beam jerking across the room, landing on the dresser. The wood strained slightly, as if something heavy leaned against the door from the hall. We froze. The storm outside roared, but inside, time felt suspended. After what felt like an eternity, the pressure eased, the dresser stopped groaning, and the silence returned. Daniel lowered the flashlight slowly. His voice was tight when he spoke. "We can't just sit here waiting. If this building collapses, or if whatever's out there comes back, we'll be trapped." Emily hugged her knees tighter. "The basement," she said again. "That's where Janet wanted everyone to go. Maybe others are already down there." Her suggestion was reasonable, yet the thought of stepping into the corridor after what we had just heard made every nerve in my body scream against it. "We don't even know where the basement is," I argued softly. "And if that wasn't Janet earlier, then whoever, or whatever, knocked could still be out there waiting." The room fell into silence once more, except for the storm. Then faintly, from the far end of the corridor, came voices. Human voices, muffled by distance and the storm, but undeniably real. I held my breath, straining to catch the words. "This way, careful, basement." Daniel's head snapped toward me. "Did you hear that?" Emily's eyes widened. "People. There are people out there." For the first time in hours, hope flickered. If others were heading to the basement, maybe safety wasn't far. But the unease never left me. The voices had sounded strangely hollow, as though carried on air too easily for words muffled by rain and walls. Daniel stood, determination in his eyes. "We can't stay. If there's shelter, we should be with the others." He began pulling the dresser back from the door. I hesitated, then moved to help him. The wood screeched against the floor, loud enough to make my stomach twist with dread. Emily stood as well, clutching her small backpack close to her chest. When the path was clear, Daniel pressed his ear against the door. Silence. No footsteps, no dragging sound, no voices. Only the storm. He unlatched the lock and slowly opened the door. The corridor stretched out dim and narrow, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning seeping through a cracked window at the far end. The carpet was damp, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and rain. We stepped out, our shoes sinking slightly into the soaked floor. Daniel led, flashlight cutting a pale path through the darkness. I followed close, Emily behind me, her breaths sharp and quick. Every door we passed was closed, though faint sounds drifted from within. Mutters, a baby crying, someone coughing. The motel was full of people, yet the hallway felt deserted, the silence unnatural. At the far end, near the stairwell, we paused. A sign hung crookedly on the wall. Storm shelter basement. The arrow pointed down a narrow flight of stairs. Daniel started down first, the beam of light bouncing along the peeling wallpaper. I followed, gripping the rail with clammy hands. Emily's footsteps echoed softly behind me. The basement smelled of damp concrete and stale air. It was larger than I expected, with a low ceiling and bare bulbs hanging from cords. To my surprise, there were indeed people. 5 or 6 travelers huddled together on folding chairs, blankets pulled tight around them. Janet was there too, standing near the back wall, flashlight in hand, her face drawn but calm. Relief surged through me. She raised her head as we entered, her eyes meeting ours. "You made it," she said softly. Daniel exhaled in relief. "We weren't sure. Someone knocked earlier." But before he could finish, my words caught in my throat. Because sitting among the group, wrapped in a blanket, was Emily. Not the Emily behind me. Another Emily. Same soaked jacket, same pale face, same wide eyes filled with fear. The Emily who had followed us into the room, who stood behind me clutching her backpack, froze. Her face drained of color. No one else seemed to notice the strangeness. The group just shifted slightly, making space for us, as though nothing were amiss. But my blood ran cold. 2 Emilys, one staring back at the other across the dim basement, the storm still raging above us. Daniel looked from one to the other, confusion etching itself across his face. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. The Emily behind me tightened her grip on my arm. Her nails dug into my sleeve. In a voice barely audible, she whispered, "Don't let go of me." I wanted to pull away, but my body wouldn't move. The storm outside screamed through the broken air vents, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. And then the basement lights flickered. The single bulb above us flickered once, twice, then steadied into a dim glow. The storm outside rumbled like a giant rolling across the sky, its echoes vibrating through the cement walls of the basement. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Everyone's attention was on the storm. Yet my eyes were locked on the impossible scene in front of me. 2 Emilys, one sitting among the travelers, clutching a blanket, the other standing just behind me, her grip on my sleeve firm and unyielding. Daniel's voice broke the silence. "What's going on here?" He pointed the flashlight directly at the Emily on the chair, then quickly swung it toward the Emily behind us. His expression was a mix of anger and disbelief. "Who are you?" The Emily behind me flinched at the light, but didn't loosen her hold. "It's me," she whispered. "I told you, my car broke down. I walked in the storm. Please don't leave me." Her eyes glistened with desperation, but the Emily across the room shook her head violently. "No," she cried out, her voice cracking. "I'm Emily. I've been here since earlier tonight. Janet let me in. I came down here when the power went out. All eyes in the basement turned toward us. The trucker sitting near the wall muttered under his breath. A woman clutched her child tighter, and Janet stepped forward, her flashlight casting long shadows against the wall. "I remember her," Janet said, gesturing toward the Emily sitting with the group. "She checked in right after you two did." Her tone was steady, but her brow furrowed as she glanced at the second Emily, the one still gripping me. My pulse pounded in my ears. The room seemed to tilt, the storm above groaning louder, as though the world itself was aware of the contradiction standing in front of us. Daniel lowered his flashlight slowly, his jaw tight. "One of you isn't real," he said flatly. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The Emily behind me gasped, shaking her head. "No, don't say that. I'm real. I can prove it." Her hand left my sleeve only long enough to unzip her backpack. She pulled out a wallet and flipped it open with trembling fingers. Inside was an ID card, the name Emily Brooks, a photo that matched her face, though the lamination was slightly cracked from water damage. "See?" she said, voice quivering. "It's me." The other Emily, the one on the chair, stood suddenly, her blanket falling to the floor. "That's mine," she shouted. "She stole it. She's not me." Murmurs rippled through the group. The woman with the baby whispered something to her husband. The trucker muttered louder this time, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Janet raised her hand. "Both of you calm down." Her gaze swept between the two women. "Something's not right here, but fighting won't help anyone." The Emily behind me clutched my arm again. "Please," she whispered, so only I could hear. "You have to believe me. You let me in. You saw me in the storm. I'm the one who knocked on your door." Her words sent a chill down my spine, because she was right. I had seen her hair dripping with rain, her eyes wide with fear, her voice trembling as she begged for safety. Yet the other Emily's presence in the basement, vouched for by Janet, was undeniable. Daniel paced, running a hand through his hair. "This doesn't make sense. How can two people be the same person?" He stopped and faced Janet. "Are you sure you saw her check in?" Janet hesitated. "I was tired. It was busy. I remember her face, yes. But..." Her voice trailed off, uncertainty creeping in. The storm crashed overhead, thunder shaking dust from the ceiling. The bulb flickered again, plunging us into near darkness for a heartbeat before humming back to life. The Emily in the blanket stepped forward, her voice urgent. "Listen, when I got here, Janet gave me room 3. I never went to room 7. That's where you were. She jabbed a finger toward the other Emily, "is lying. She's pretending to be me." The Emily behind me stiffened. "That's not true. They're trying to confuse you. Don't listen to her." Her grip on me tightened until it hurt. I tried to pull away, but her nails dug deeper, as though she feared I would slip through her fingers if she let go. Daniel's patience snapped. "Enough!" His voice rang out across the basement. "If one of you is fake, then prove who's real. Tell us something only the real Emily would know." Silence fell. Both Emilys stared at him, their faces pale in the dim light. The one in the blanket spoke first. "My birthday is April 4th, 1992. I live in Salina. I was driving back from visiting my sister when my car broke down. My license plate is KS 437. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed. The other Emily shook her head, her eyes wild. That's what I told you. She's repeating me. She's like a shadow. She's not real. The trucker finally stood, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. This is crazy, he muttered, his voice gravelly. Storm's bad enough without this nonsense. One of them is lying, or worse. The woman with the baby began to cry quietly, rocking her child in her arms. Janet's flashlight trembled slightly in her hand. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the Emily clinging to me. "Let him go," she said firmly. "If you're who you say you are, you don't need to hold on to him like that." For the first time, the Emily behind me hesitated. Her hand loosened, her eyes darting between Janet and me. Slowly, reluctantly, she released her grip. My arm ached from the pressure, faint marks already forming on my sleeve. The storm howled louder, rain hammering against the narrow basement windows. The bulb flickered again, plunging us into brief darkness. And in that instant, I felt something cold brush past me. Not the wind, not rain, something else. When the light returned, both Emilis were standing, staring at each other from across the room. Their faces mirror images filled with fear and fury. Then the child cried louder, the sound piercing through the tension, and the storm above let out a deafening crack of thunder that shook the foundation of the motel. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and somewhere in the distance glass shattered. Everyone ducked instinctively, covering their heads. When I looked up again, one of the Emilis was gone. The blanket lay crumpled on the floor, empty. The remaining Emily stood frozen, her chest heaving, eyes wide as if she herself couldn't believe what had just happened. The group erupted into panicked whispers. Daniel's face was pale, his hand gripping my shoulder tightly. "Did you see where she went?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head, my throat too dry to answer. Janet's flashlight darted across the basement, searching corners, shadows, the narrow doorway leading back to the stairs. But there was nothing, just the storm, and the single Emily left standing, trembling under everyone's gaze. The air in the basement grew heavier still, the storm pressing against the walls like an unwelcome guest trying to force its way in. The bulb flickered once more, and in that moment of half-darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that the missing Emily hadn't left at all, that she was still here, somewhere in the shadows. The days in London grew shorter as autumn crept in. The incident at George's house had left an impression on everyone, and although they tried to move on, the memory of that night never completely faded. Daniel often replayed the sounds of the door slamming, the sharp cry in the hallway, and the cold draft that swept through the living room. He told himself it was only imagination, a product of fatigue and drink. But deep inside he knew what he had seen was more than a trick of the mind. George, however, tried to laugh it off. He had always been the most stubborn of them all, unwilling to give fear any place in his thoughts. "Old houses creak, that's all," he repeated whenever someone brought it up. But the firmness of his voice was betrayed by the way his hands trembled slightly when he poured himself another drink. Claire remained quiet most of the time. She had been the one who swore she saw a shadow by the staircase, a figure that did not belong to any of them. Since then, her nights had been restless, haunted by dreams that blurred the line between memory and imagination. The others noticed the dark circles under her eyes, but avoided mentioning them, afraid to draw the shadow of that night closer. A week later, Daniel suggested they meet again, this time in a different place. He wanted to test whether it was the house or themselves who had become the target of something unexplained. They gathered at Claire's flat near Brixton, a more modern apartment, far from the centuries-old walls of George's home. The atmosphere was lighter, the furniture new, the walls freshly painted, with no sense of history pressing down on them. The evening began with music, laughter, and chatter. They tried to convince themselves they were just a group of friends enjoying another weekend together. For a while it worked, yet as the night deepened, the memory of that previous gathering seemed to seep into the room. Silence grew heavier between conversations. Each of them felt it, though no one dared to say it aloud. At midnight, a strange thing happened. The lights flickered for a moment, then returned to normal. Daniel froze, his drink halfway to his lips. Claire's eyes darted to the ceiling lamp, while George forced a laugh. "Electricity, nothing more," he said, though he could not stop glancing at the darkened hallway that stretched beyond the living room. It was Anna who finally broke the tension. She had been quiet since the first incident, preferring to keep her thoughts to herself, but now she leaned forward, her face pale. "You all feel it too, don't you? It's not about George's house. It's about us." Her words unsettled everyone. George scoffed, shaking his head, but Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered the cold draft from before, the sound of the unseen footsteps. Could it really be something following them? Not tied to a place, but to their gathering itself? The night dragged on with unease. They stayed together until dawn, reluctant to be alone. Nothing else happened that night, yet the fear remained like a shadow that refused to lift. Days turned into weeks, and life carried on. George focused on his work. Daniel buried himself in writing. Claire tried to escape through long walks in the city, and Anna avoided gatherings altogether. Yet the bond between them had changed. They no longer spoke of what happened, but it lingered in the silence whenever their eyes met. Then came winter. Snow dusted the streets of London. The air filled with the smell of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine from market stalls. The city sparkled with festive lights, but beneath the glitter, the group felt an invisible weight pressing on them. On a bitterly cold evening, Daniel received a call from George. His voice was tense, almost breaking. "Come over," he said, without explanation. Daniel did not hesitate. By the time he arrived, Claire and Anna were already there, sitting stiffly on the sofa. George paced the room, pale and restless. He told them what had happened. The night before, he had been alone in the house when he heard someone whisper his name. Not once, but several times. The voice came from the stairwell, where the shadows seemed deeper than usual. He swore he saw a figure at the top of the stairs, unmoving, watching him. When he tried to approach, the lights went out, and the air turned icy cold. No one laughed this time. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Claire pressed her hands together until her knuckles turned white. Anna whispered, "It's not just a shadow anymore. It wants us to see it." They stayed in George's house that night, though none of them dared to sleep. The hours crawled by, filled with the sound of the old building groaning in the wind. At 3 in the morning, a heavy knock echoed through the hallway. They froze. The sound came again, deliberate and slow, as though someone or something was at the door. When George finally opened it, the hallway was empty, only the bitter cold sweeping inside. After that night, they stopped meeting altogether. Fear had pulled them apart, scattering them into different corners of the city. But separation did not bring peace. Each of them began to experience things on their own. Whispers in the dark, shadows at the edge of vision, the feeling of being watched. Daniel, unable to sleep, poured his experiences into a journal, hoping that writing would release the weight on his chest. Claire took to leaving lights on in every room. Anna moved to another flat, but the unease followed her. George became a shell of himself, often found staring into empty spaces as if expecting something to appear. By the time Spring returned to London, their friendship had unraveled completely. What once brought them together now kept them apart, yet none of them could escape the bond they shared, forged not by choice, but by an encounter with something unseen, something that clung to them no matter how far they tried to run. The city bloomed again, the parks filled with laughter, the pubs with music, but for them, life had changed forever. They carried the silence, the fear, and the memory of that night like a scar. And sometimes, when the streets grew quiet and the lights flickered just slightly, they each wondered if the shadow would one day step fully into the light, no longer content to linger at the edge of sight. The days that followed in Austin stretched into something almost surreal for me. Each morning, I would wake up with the memory of that phone call still ringing in my ears. The raspy voice, the strange familiarity in his tone, the way he seemed to know things about me he shouldn't. It all wrapped itself around my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake off. I told myself it was nothing more than coincidence, maybe even a cruel prank, but deep down, a part of me wasn't convinced. I started paying closer attention to the world around me. When I walked down South Congress Avenue, weaving through the weekend crowds, I found myself checking every face, wondering if one of them might belong to the man from the payphone. Even the sound of footsteps behind me on quiet streets made my heart beat faster. Austin had always felt like a city alive with music and color, but now it had taken on another layer, a veil of uncertainty that made even familiar places feel new and unsettling. One evening, about a week later, I passed by the same payphone again. It was late, the neon glow from a taco truck spilling across the sidewalk, and the phone stood there as it always had, battered and stubbornly out of place in a world that no longer seemed to need it. I slowed my steps, staring at it. The receiver hung crookedly, and the paint on the booth's metal frame was peeling. Something in me hesitated, but I couldn't walk away. I lifted the receiver, half expecting nothing but static. Instead, I heard a faint click, and then silence. I held my breath, my pulse quickening. "Hello?" My own voice sounded unsteady, too loud against the hush of the night. For several long seconds, there was nothing. Then, as if from far away, the voice returned. "You came back." It was the same rasp, slow and deliberate. A shiver ran through me. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You don't remember yet, but you will. Austin keeps its memories. So will you." I froze. His words were strange, almost poetic, but they pressed on me like a weight. "What do you mean? How do you know me?" There was a pause, the faint crackle of the line, and then, "The night at Zilker Park. You were there. You saw." Zilker Park. The name alone stirred something at the edge of my memory, but I couldn't place it. I hadn't been to Zilker in months, maybe longer. Before I could ask more, the line went dead. I stood there, clutching the receiver, feeling the world tilt slightly. People walked past me, laughing, carrying late-night snacks, oblivious to the chill that had just settled into my bones. Finally, I set the receiver back into its cradle and walked away, my mind racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his words. searching my memories for something I had missed. Zilker Park. A night. Something I had seen. But the harder I tried, the more elusive it felt, like smoke slipping through my fingers. The following weekend, I decided to go to Zilker Park. It was a Saturday, the kind of day that made Austin buzz with life. Families spread out on picnic blankets, kids tossed frisbees, and couples strolled hand in hand. I wandered through the park, scanning faces, searching for something familiar. I stopped near Barton Springs, the water glittering under the afternoon sun, and closed my eyes, letting the sounds of the park wash over me. And then, a flicker of memory, the smell of rain on wet grass. A crowd gathered, not for play but for something else. Flashing lights, red and blue. The sound of someone shouting, then crying. My heart tightened. I opened my eyes, breathless. It wasn't from today. It was a memory from years ago. A night when I had stumbled upon something at Zilker. Something I hadn't thought about in a long time. I remembered walking home late, the path dimly lit, when I came across the flashing lights. Police cars lined the road. An ambulance parked near the field. I had slowed, trying to see, and caught a glimpse of something I wish I hadn't. A body on the ground, covered with a sheet. People whispered about an accident. Maybe something worse. I had only stayed for a moment before hurrying away, pushing the memory down as if it never happened. But now, it came rushing back. Was that what the voice on the payphone was talking about? The thought unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. That night had nothing to do with me. I had just been there by chance. So how could someone know I had seen it? As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, I left the park and walked back toward the city. My phone buzzed in my pocket. When I pulled it out, I froze. No number, just the words. Call from payphone. My stomach dropped. Payphones didn't usually show up on caller ID. I answered, my voice barely above a whisper. Hello. You remember now, the voice said. My knees went weak. Why are you doing this? What do you want from me? The silence stretched. Then, the truth always finds a way back. You saw what they wanted hidden, and now, so do I. The line went dead again. I stood on the sidewalk, the world moving around me in blurred motion. Music spilled out from a nearby bar, the scent of barbecue drifting in the air. But I felt completely cut off from it all. Whoever this was, they weren't just playing games. They knew too much. And somehow, I had been pulled into something I didn't understand. From that night on, I couldn't escape the sense of being watched. Every time I passed the payphone, I half expected it to ring. Some nights it did, some nights it didn't. But the silence was almost worse, because it meant I was waiting, caught between fear and curiosity. I started keeping a journal, writing down every detail I remembered about that night in Zilker Park. The flashing lights, the crowd, the shape under the sheet, a police officer's face, partly shadowed but stern, and something else, someone standing at the edge of the scene, staring right at me before I hurried away. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. Maybe this wasn't just about memory. Maybe it was about unfinished business, something that had been buried that night and was now clawing its way back. And through it all, the payphone stood there on the corner, a silent witness, waiting under the vast expanse of the Texas sky. The journey that began on that quiet evening did not simply fade into memory. Instead, it unraveled into a longer chain of moments, each one carrying its own weight and meaning. Life had a way of turning fleeting encounters into anchors, and for Mark, the stranger whose kindness had once been the difference between despair and hope, the road ahead continued to bring surprises he could never have anticipated. After leaving the gas station where it all began, Mark kept driving toward Dallas. The city lights eventually emerged on the horizon, flickering like a promise. He felt both anxious and hopeful, an odd mixture, as though the kindness he had just received carried with it an unseen responsibility. His thoughts returned again and again to the man who had helped him, John, whose simple act of generosity had changed everything. Mark found himself replaying the conversation in his mind. The tone of John's voice, the firm grip of his handshake, the sincerity in his eyes. When he finally reached Dallas, it was well past midnight. The city was still buzzing with life. Bars spilling laughter onto the sidewalks, neon signs glowing, traffic humming on the freeways. Mark pulled into a small motel near Oak Cliff, one of the cheaper places where he could stretch what little money he had left. As he lay on the stiff mattress that night, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence, he realized he was at a crossroads. He could either treat John's kindness as a temporary lifeline, or he could use it as a reason to rebuild, to start over with more determination than before. The next morning, he woke early. The sun was already blazing, casting long streaks of gold across the worn curtains. He stepped outside, the scent of asphalt warming in the heat, and the sound of cicadas already humming in the trees. He took a deep breath and felt, for the first time in weeks, a flicker of possibility. Dallas was big, full of opportunities if he could only find them. Over the next few days, Mark walked the streets of downtown, searching for work. He carried a small folder with his resume, though it was thin and out of date. He stopped into coffee shops, hardware stores, delivery services, anywhere that looked like it might be hiring. The rejections piled up quickly, each one delivered with polite words but firm finality. Still, he didn't give up. Each night, he reminded himself of John's words, how a stranger believed in him enough to help. That belief was now his compass. One afternoon, while wandering through Deep Ellum, a neighborhood known for its music and murals, Mark stopped to admire a local artist painting on the side of a building. The man, sweat dripping down his forehead, noticed Mark standing there and offered a nod. They struck up a conversation, and Mark mentioned he was new in town, looking for work. The artist laughed and said he wasn't hiring, but he pointed Mark toward a nearby diner where the manager was desperate for reliable staff. Mark walked there immediately, and by the end of the week, he had a job washing dishes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. The kitchen was hot, noisy, filled with the clang of pots and pans and the sharp scent of grease. Yet Mark felt alive in that environment. He worked long shifts, his hands raw from soap and water, his feet aching by the end of the night. But he didn't complain. Each paycheck, no matter how small, was a step away from the life he had been running from. Months passed. Slowly, Mark began to carve out a new rhythm. He saved money, enough to rent a small apartment near Fair Park. It was nothing more than a single room with cracked walls and a leaky faucet, but it was his. In the evenings, after long shifts at the diner, he would sit by the window, watching the trains pass in the distance, and think about how far he had come since that night at the gas station. But something gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to thank John again, to show him how much his kindness had mattered. He remembered John mentioning he lived near Austin, and one weekend, when Mark finally had enough money for gas, He drove back south. He had no address, no phone number, just a name and a city. He asked around, stopping at diners and gas stations, describing the man who had helped him. Most people shrugged, some offered vague directions, but no one knew for sure. It was late in the afternoon when Mark pulled into a small roadside cafe just outside Austin. He ordered coffee and sat by the window, watching the cars roll by on the highway. As he stirred the sugar into his cup, he heard a familiar laugh. He looked up, and there, sitting across the cafe with a group of friends, was John. For a moment, Mark hesitated. What if John didn't remember him? What if the moment that had been so life-changing for Mark was just a small, forgettable gesture for John? But then John looked up. Their eyes met, and recognition lit across his face. He stood, smiling, and walked over. "I'll be damned," John said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I was wondering if I'd ever see you again." The reunion was warm, filled with laughter and stories. Mark told him about the diner job, the small apartment, the slow but steady climb back to stability. John listened intently, nodding with pride. "That's what I was hoping for," he said. "Not that you'd remember me, but that you'd remember what hope feels like." From that day forward, the two men kept in touch. They met occasionally for coffee whenever Mark visited Austin, or when John happened to be in Dallas for work. What had started as a random act of kindness became a genuine friendship. John introduced Mark to people who could help him grow. Mentors, small business owners, community leaders. Mark, for his part, gave back whenever he could. He volunteered at shelters, offered food to strangers, and once even helped a young man stranded at a bus station by paying for his ticket. Years went by. Mark eventually left the diner and found work in logistics, then later in management. His life stabilized, then flourished. He married, had children, bought a modest home. But through all of it, he never forgot the gas station in the middle of Texas, the night when despair nearly swallowed him, and how a stranger's kindness had lit the way forward. He often told his children the story, not as a tale of hardship, but as a lesson in compassion. "You never know what someone is carrying," he would say, "and sometimes the smallest gesture can change the whole direction of a life." The circle of kindness continued, passed from one person to the next, like a torch in the dark. And whenever Mark found himself driving through the highways of Texas, he would glance at the passing gas stations, the long stretches of empty road, and smile, because he knew that somewhere out there, countless other stories of strangers and kindness were unfolding, each one carrying the same quiet power that had once saved him. The days after the strange night at the abandoned farmhouse passed with a weight that never seemed to leave Thomas's chest. He still heard the echo of that voice, the hollow whisper carried by the wind through the broken walls of the building. Every time he closed his eyes at night, he saw the shadowy figure standing by the stairwell, unmoving, watching, as if it had no purpose but to linger. Thomas tried to bury himself in routine. He returned to his carpentry work, repairing fences, fixing barns for neighbors, and sawing wood in his backyard workshop. The sound of the saw biting into the wood gave him a sense of normality. But it never lasted. At quiet moments, the whisper found its way back to him, threading itself into his mind with a persistence that frightened him. His sister, Margaret, visited from Austin one Friday morning. She hadn't seen him in months and arrived with her husband, Richard. They brought groceries, coffee beans, and fresh bread. Margaret had a warm smile, the kind that usually put Thomas at ease. But this time she quickly noticed his distracted demeanor. "Tom, you look pale," she said as they sat around his kitchen table. "Have you been sleeping?" Thomas hesitated, then shook his head. "Not much. The nights are noisy." Richard laughed, pouring coffee into his mug. "Noisy? Out here in the country, the only noise you've got is crickets and wind." Thomas looked at him, unsure if he should say more. Margaret reached across the table, her hand resting gently on his. "Tell me what you mean." For a moment, Thomas considered brushing it off, but the memory of that voice was too heavy to keep hidden. He told them about the night at the farmhouse, about the whisper that came from nowhere, the figure at the stairwell, and how the sound had followed him back home. His voice trembled as he spoke, though he tried to stay calm. Margaret's expression tightened. She knew her brother was not one to exaggerate or invent stories. Richard, on the other hand, scoffed. "You scared yourself. That place is falling apart. Sounds bounce around in empty houses. As for the shadow, it was probably your eyes playing tricks." Thomas looked down at his hands. He wanted to believe Richard, but deep inside he knew what he had experienced wasn't a trick. Margaret gave her husband a sharp look, then turned back to Thomas. "You're not imagining it. I can tell, but maybe we can help. Let's go there tomorrow, in daylight. If you show us the place, maybe we'll figure out what's going on." Thomas agreed, though unease spread through his chest. The thought of stepping back into that farmhouse filled him with dread. But he couldn't face the mystery alone any longer. The next morning, the three of them drove out to the farmhouse. The dirt road was rough, and the air was heavy with the scent of cedar. As the house came into view, standing crooked against the horizon, Margaret squeezed Thomas's hand. "Stay close," she whispered. They walked through the tall grass, their footsteps crunching over broken glass and fallen shingles. The house groaned in the breeze. Richard led the way inside, his skepticism still painted across his face. The sunlight filtered through the holes in the roof, casting angled beams of light across the dusty floor. "See? Just an old house," Richard said. "Nothing to be afraid of." But as they reached the stairwell, Thomas froze. The exact spot where he had seen the figure. His breath caught, his chest tightening as memories flooded back. Margaret noticed his trembling and wrapped her arm around him. Then they heard it, a low whisper, so faint it might have been mistaken for wind, yet it carried words. Distinct, clear, the same words Thomas had heard that night. Margaret's eyes widened, and for the first time Richard's mocking grin faltered. "What the hell was that?" Richard muttered, his voice breaking slightly. The whisper came again, this time closer. None of them could deny it. The air grew colder, and a deep unease filled the room. Margaret clutched Thomas's hand tighter. "We should leave," she whispered. But the farmhouse wasn't ready to let them go so easily. The whisper swelled into a broken cry, echoing down the hallway. Boards creaked above them, though the house had no second story. Dust drifted from the ceiling like falling ash. Richard, now visibly shaken, grabbed Margaret's arm. "Out! Now!" They stumbled back into the daylight, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding. Outside, the wind was still. Too still. No sound of birds, no hum of insects. The silence was unnatural. Thomas leaned against the truck, his hands shaking. "Do you believe me now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Richard could only nod, his face pale. That night, Margaret and Richard stayed at Thomas's house. None of them spoke much during dinner. They avoided the subject, but the silence in the room was thick with fear. When the clock struck midnight, the whisper returned, not from the farmhouse this time, but from the walls of Thomas's home. It slithered through the rooms, brushing against their ears, calling their names. Margaret clung to her brother, while Richard grabbed the shotgun from above the fireplace, though he knew it was useless against something unseen. The whisper grew louder, circling them, until finally, every lamp in the house flickered and went dark. And in that suffocating blackness, the shadow appeared again. This time, it wasn't bound to the farmhouse. It had followed them. As the last day of summer faded into the crisp breath of autumn, the small town that had once held so many unanswered questions began to quiet itself again. The memories of that strange night, the gathering of strangers who had somehow become companions, and the lingering sense that fate had intervened, all seemed to drift like smoke into the horizon. Some of them left town, returning to their own lives with stories they would never fully share. Others stayed, finding comfort in the unexpected friendships that had bloomed. Yet each carried with them the invisible thread that tied their destinies together, a reminder that sometimes the most profound chapters of life are written in places we never intended to be. The old house, once echoing with laughter and secrets, now stood silent again. Its windows reflected the golden light of the setting sun, and its walls seemed to hold the whispers of all that had transpired. To passers-by, it was nothing more than an ordinary home on a quiet street. But to those who had lived through that night, it was a place that had forever altered the rhythm of their lives. In the end, the story was not about a single event or a fleeting mystery, but about how strangers can cross paths, collide with fate, and walk away changed. And though the night was long over, its echoes remained in their hearts, reminding them that sometimes the most extraordinary moments are the ones we never expect, and the most unforgettable connections are born in silence, under the weight of unspoken truths. Life moved forward, as it always does, but the memory of that night would never leave them. It lingered quietly, like the last note of a song long after it had ended, soft, haunting, and unforgettable.